There's a heaviness that comes with certain places, a kind of weight that sinks into your skin, that you don't notice right away but feel creeping in slowly, day by day. That's how it was with the apartment. It wasn't much. Just 4 grey walls in a tired, aging building on the edge of Norilsk. People called it the most depressing city in the world, and they weren't wrong. The air here felt thick, like it was clinging to you, and it never really warmed up, even when the sun peeked through the clouds. Most days it didn't. You lived in a kind of grey, perpetual twilight, where the hours bled into each other, and you weren't sure if you were waking up or going to bed. I moved into the apartment because it was cheap, no questions asked, and the landlord didn't care about anything more than getting the rent on time. It seemed perfect at first, a small place of my own, quiet neighbours who kept to themselves. Too quiet maybe, but I didn't mind. In the early days, I tried to make the place feel like home. I hung up a few framed photos, made a corner for myself where I could curl up with a book or drink tea while watching the snow fall outside. It wasn't much, but it felt like mine. For the first time in a long time, I had a place where no one would bother me. The silence, once so welcome, slowly started to become oppressive. Yet at first, I chalked it up to the weather, the long nights, and the isolation that comes from living in a city like Norilsk. I had been living there for just over 2 months when I noticed I was out of cooking oil. It seemed like a small inconvenience, but the thought of braving the cold again didn't sit well with me. The store was a fair walk away, and I wasn't keen on making the trip. I remembered the babushka who lived a few doors down. I'd seen her a couple of times, a small, hunched figure with deep lines on her face, always shuffling in and out of her apartment. She never said much, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to ask. Just a little cooking oil, nothing more. I knocked on her door, hoping she'd answer quickly. The hallway felt colder than usual that day. The door opened, but only just. The chain stayed hooked, and the babushka peered through the small gap. Her eyes were pale, milky, like she hadn't slept in days. "Do you have any cooking oil?" I asked, trying to smile, but something about her face stopped me cold. She stared at me for a moment, her gaze flicking past me to the hallway, like she was checking for something. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, and I thought she might be confused by the question. "You shouldn't trust them," she said, her voice low, almost a rasp. I blinked. "What?" She didn't elaborate. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, sharp and cold. "The neighbors. Don't trust them. Don't get close." Before I could ask her what she meant, she slammed the door shut, the chain rattling against the frame. I stood there, frozen, my question about cooking oil forgotten. The words echoed in my head. Don't trust them. I turned slowly, glancing down the empty hallway. The doors were all closed, the silence oppressive. I wasn't sure what she meant, but something about the way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't knock on her door again after that. The next few weeks passed without much incident, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a strange feeling that lingered, like the air in the building had changed. It wasn't anything I could explain, but there were small things, subtle things. The apartment, for one, had started to feel colder. The radiator clanged and hissed like always, but the heat never seemed to reach me. I noticed small cracks appearing along the walls, just thin lines at first, barely noticeable, but they spread quickly, like veins crawling across the plaster. At first I thought it was the cold that was making me feel so uneasy. Norilsk was known for its bitter winters, and sometimes the relentless greyness of the city seeps into your soul. But this was different. It wasn't just cold. It was as if the apartment itself was draining me, bit by bit, like some invisible force was feeding off my energy. I tried to keep busy to ignore the sensation. I focused on work, on reading, on anything that could take my mind off the creeping dread that seemed to fill every corner of my apartment. But no matter how hard I tried, the feeling lingered. And then there were the bugs. It started with one cockroach skittering across the kitchen floor. I thought nothing of it at first, just a nuisance, something I could deal with. But then, more appeared. They crawled from the cracks in the walls, their shiny bodies slipping out in the dead of night, disappearing just as quickly. I hated them. They made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just an old building, and old buildings had pests. But as the days went on, they seemed to multiply, no matter how much I cleaned. No matter how hard I tried to block the cracks, they kept coming. One night, the sound of scratching woke me. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear it again. It was faint but persistent, like something was moving inside the walls. I threw off the covers and crept toward the noise, barefoot, my breath catching in my throat. The wall next to my bed, the one with the longest crack, was trembling. I stepped closer, leaning in, and the scratching grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to get out. And then, without warning, a single crack widened. A wave of black bugs spilled out, flooding across the floor, scurrying over my feet. I stumbled back with a scream, brushing them off, my skin crawling as they scattered into the shadows. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone. But as I looked around, the apartment was still. The bugs had disappeared into the cracks again, leaving no trace behind. Only the silence remained. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the building. It creaked and groaned like it was alive, shifting beneath my weight. Every now and then, I would hear the faint sound of scurrying, but I forced myself to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. The morning after, I knew I couldn't leave the cracks as they were. No one could sleep with the thought of insects slipping through those gaps. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the icy streets, determined to fix the problem. The hardware store was a short walk, but the cold bit into me harder than usual. As I browsed the aisles, I grabbed some plaster and sealant, just enough to patch up the cracks and hopefully put my mind at ease. I didn't want to deal with those bugs again. Back at the apartment, I set to work. The cracks weren't large, but they were everywhere, snaking along the walls in long, jagged lines. I plastered over them, smoothing out the gaps as best I could. I didn't care if it was temporary, I just wanted to stop the bugs from getting in. When I finished, I stood back, eyeing the freshly patched walls. It looked better, cleaner even. But that sense of unease didn't go away. I sprayed the corners with bug spray just in case, and spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it. For a while, the apartment felt normal again, and I convinced myself that maybe I'd gotten it under control. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the first creak. It wasn't anything unusual at first, just the typical groaning of an old building. But then there was another sound, something softer, like a shuffle of feet or a door opening. I sat up, listening carefully. The sound was faint, but it was coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a low murmur. Voices. I opened the door a crack, peering into the dim hallway. Two of my neighbors stood at the far end, near the stairwell. They were talking quietly, too quietly for me to make out their words. It wasn't unusual to see people here, but something about the way they were standing, huddled together in the shadows, made my skin crawl. I was about to close the door when one of them turned sharply, his gaze locking onto mine. I froze. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment before nudging the other person. They both disappeared down the stairs without a word. I closed the door, heart racing, trying to shake off the encounter. People here were strange, sure, but I didn't think much of it until the next day, when I realized the two neighbors hadn't returned. Their apartment door stayed closed, the lights off, and for the next few days, I didn't see or hear them at all. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. It was like they'd vanished. At first, I didn't think much of it. People left Norilsk all the time. The city was a bleak, isolating place. People came and went, often without notice. But as the days stretched on, their absence gnawed at me. Something about their departure felt wrong. They didn't seem like the type to just leave, and I couldn't shake the memory of their lingering gaze before they disappeared down the stairs. A week later, I saw the babushka again. I hadn't spoken to her since she'd warned me about the neighbors, and I wasn't eager to bring it up. But that day, as I walked past her apartment, the door opened a crack. Her pale, milky eyes peered through the gap, her expression unreadable. "You're still here," she said, her voice hoarse. I paused, unsure of what to say. "Yeah." She glanced around the hallway, then back at me, lowering her voice. "Have you seen them? The ones who leave?" I hesitated. "What do you mean?" She sighed, shaking her head. "They don't leave, not really." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" "They disappear, one by one." She coughed, the sound rough and wet. "They're still here, but not how you think. The building, it keeps them. It takes what it needs." "Oh." Her words made my stomach churn, but before I could ask more, she closed the door with a soft click. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what she'd said, but it didn't make sense. People left all the time, didn't they? It was just a strange old woman's paranoia. At least that's what I told myself. The next day I noticed something else. One of the doors down the hall, the apartment where I'd seen the neighbors last, was slightly ajar. Just a crack. No light came from inside, and the air around it felt colder than usual. I hadn't seen anyone come or go from that apartment in days, and I wasn't sure anyone still lived there. I stared at the door for a long time, debating whether to knock or walk away, but something held me back, an odd feeling, like the air itself was warning me to stay away. I backed off, heading quickly for the stairs. As I descended, I glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement through the crack in the door. Something or someone was watching. Over the next few nights, the building seemed to grow more restless. The cold became unbearable, seeping through the walls despite the heat blasting from the radiator. The lights flickered constantly, plunging the hallway into darkness at odd intervals, and the noises, they were getting louder. Every night I heard them, scratching, shuffling, always just outside my apartment door. I couldn't tell if it was the building settling, the neighbors, or something else entirely, but it never stopped. I barely slept, the sound gnawing at my nerves. I patched up the cracks again, but no matter how many times I did, they always came back, deeper and wider. And it wasn't just the cracks. The walls themselves seemed wrong. It felt like they were shifting when I wasn't looking, moving just out of the corner of my eye. It was late, somewhere around 2 a.m., when I woke with the need to go to the bathroom. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the radiator in the corner. I tossed off the covers, still groggy from sleep, and padded toward the bathroom, rubbing my eyes. When I flipped the bathroom light on, something caught my eye just above the sink. A crack, a new one, long and jagged, snaking through the wall like a scar that had just appeared overnight. I frowned, stepping closer. The cracks were spreading faster now. I had noticed a few new ones the week before, but this one felt different, larger, more menacing. Then from the corner of my eye I saw movement. A bug, small and black, its shiny body slipping through the crack. I flinched, backing away from the sink. The bug scuttled across the tiles, disappearing into the corner. I stood there, heart pounding, watching as more bugs started to emerge from the crack. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and hurried out of the bathroom, only to stop dead in my tracks. In the bedroom, more bugs were spilling from the walls. They crawled through the cracks, pouring onto the floor, their bodies shining in the faint light from the window. There were too many, dozens, maybe hundreds, scurrying along the walls, slipping under the bed. Panic rose in my chest. I couldn't stay here, not with the walls crawling with insects. I grabbed my jacket and shoes, pulling them on as fast as I could. My hands shook as I stuffed my phone into my pocket and darted for the door. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The hallway felt colder than usual. The dim light overhead flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows along the floor. My breath came out in short bursts, clouding the air in front of me as I slammed the door behind me. For a moment, I stood there, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath. Then I heard it. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first, like the faint rustling of paper. But it wasn't paper. It was coming from further down the hallway, from behind one of the apartment doors. I froze, straining to listen, the sound growing louder with each passing second. My pulse quickened. It wasn't just rustling now. There was scratching, like tiny claws dragging themselves against the wood. I turned slowly, my eyes narrowing as I squinted at the darkened doorway ahead. The air felt too still, too thick. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The scratching intensified, becoming frantic, like something was desperately trying to claw its way out. The door creaked. It was subtle at first, a soft moan of hinges under strain, but then it grew louder. A slow, deliberate groan that made my blood run cold. My heart pounded in my ears as the door opened inch by inch, revealing nothing but a yawning black void inside. I stared into that darkness, frozen in place. The air seemed to shift, a strange scent, damp and earthy, wafting toward me from the open door. And then in the silence something moved. A rat emerged. It slipped from the shadows, its slick grey body catching the flickering light as it scurried forward. Then another, and another. In a heartbeat, they were pouring out of the apartment, dozens of them, maybe more. Their bodies writhed together, claws scraping against the floor. their small, beady eyes glinting in the half-light. The sound of their feet, thousands of tiny nails on wood, was deafening. I wanted to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as the mass of rats surged toward me like a living tide. And then instinct kicked in. I ran, my shoes slamming against the floor as I tore down the hallway. The sound of squeaking and scratching exploded behind me, the rats following close. They moved fast, too fast. I could hear them just inches away. The hallway seemed to stretch out in front of me, endless and dark. The air felt thick and suffocating, my lungs burning with every ragged breath I took. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, mixing with the high-pitched squeals of the rats, a cacophony of terror closing in on me. I turned the corner, nearly losing my balance as I stumbled into the stairwell. I grabbed the railing, half jumping, half falling down the stairs. My foot slipped on the last step, and I crashed into the wall with a dull thud, pain shooting through my arm. But there was no time to think. The rats were still coming. I threw myself forward, running toward the basement door. It felt impossibly far away, my legs shaking, my vision tunneling as panic flooded my system. The squealing was deafening now, the swarm of rats almost on top of me. The basement, I had to reach the basement. I lunged for the door, slamming into it with my shoulder, my fingers scrabbling at the cold metal handle. The door creaked open, and I stumbled inside, collapsing against the floor. I kicked it shut behind me, the echo of the slam reverberating through the basement as I lay there, gasping for air. I pressed my back against the door, my body trembling with adrenaline. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breath, heavy and ragged, filling the stillness. But outside, on the other side of the door, I could still hear them. The scratching, the frantic scraping of tiny claws. The rats weren't done. The basement was like stepping into another world, cold, damp, and suffocatingly dark. The chill hit me immediately, sinking into my bones, and I could feel the moisture clinging to my skin. Every breath I took fogged in front of me, hanging in the air like ghostly wisps. But there was no time to think, no time to adjust. My fingers trembled as I fumbled with my phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam sputtered to life, casting a weak, flickering light through the gloom. It barely cut through the darkness, the shadows thick and oppressive, like they were swallowing the light. The staircase ahead descended into a void that seemed deeper than I remembered. I had no choice. I had to keep moving. I had to get away from the rats. The stairs groaned beneath me as I took the first step, a deep, echoing creak that reverberated through the empty space. My heart pounded harder with each step, the sound of my own breath loud in my ears. The air down here felt even thicker, like trying to breathe through damp cloth. It wasn't just cold, it was oppressive, like something was pressing in from all sides. And then there was the smell, metallic and sharp, almost like blood. The further I went, the worse it became. My foot hit the bottom of the stairs, and for a brief second I paused. I could feel something, a vibration, faint but unmistakable, thrumming through the floor beneath me. Then I heard it. A faint thump, low and rhythmic, steady. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my nerves, but the sound only grew louder, its pulsing beat reverberating through the walls, the floor, the very air around me. I could feel it inside me now, an eerie, rhythmic drumming that seemed to echo my own heartbeat. Each beat felt heavier than the last, pulling me further into the basement, dragging me towards something I didn't want to face. My flashlight swept across the room in front of me, illuminating more of the basement. The shadows danced and shifted, playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it. In the center of the basement, suspended from the ceiling, was something out of a nightmare, a massive, grotesque heart. It hung there, pulsing slowly, its slick surface glistening with moisture. Thick, blackened veins snaked out from the heart, creeping up the walls like twisted arteries. They spread through the cracks, disappearing into the structure of the building as if the entire place was feeding off it. Each beat sent a ripple through the room, the veins tightening and contracting as if they were pumping something through the walls. My stomach churned at the sight, a wave of nausea washing over me. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. What was this? How could this be real? The air grew colder, the heart's beat more insistent. I could feel it drawing me in, the slow, steady thrum filling my chest, suffocating me. My thoughts spun, panic rising. I had to leave. Now. I turned, ready to bolt for the stairs. But before I could move, something clamped down on my shoulder. I screamed, whipping around, the flashlight's beams swinging wildly. There he was, one of my neighbors. His face was ghostly pale, eyes sunken deep into his skull. What scared me most was the eerie calm in his expression. His grip tightened on my shoulder, firm and unyielding. "The building needs a sacrifice," he said, his voice low and emotionless, as though he was reciting something rehearsed. "It has to feed." His grip on me tightened as he spoke again, his voice a harsh whisper. "We all have to feed it. It's the only way to survive." I struggled frantically, panic surging through my veins. I twisted my body, driving my elbow into his side. He grunted, loosening his grip just enough for me to tear myself free. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, but he wasn't finished. He rushed toward me, his eyes now wild with desperation. I shoved him with all the strength I could muster. He staggered back, his foot catching on a pipe behind him. He lost his balance, and with a sickening crack, his head collided with the rusted metal. He crumpled to the ground, motionless. For a moment, everything was still. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, staring at his unmoving body. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened, but there was no time. The ground beneath my feet trembled. The basement shuddered. The cracks in the walls widened, spider-webbing outward. From within those cracks, something began to pour out. Rats. Hundreds of them, their slick bodies writhing as they squeezed through the gaps. I bolted for the stairs, my legs burning as I ran. When I reached the basement door, my heart sank. It wouldn't budge. I yanked at the handle, pounded on the door with my fists, screaming for help. My voice echoed in the empty space, but the door didn't move. The rats were coming. I could hear them now, their squeaks filling the air, the sound of their bodies writhing together growing louder, closer. I turned and saw them, just a few feet away, their beady eyes glinting in the dim light. They swarmed toward me, a living tide of filth and hunger. I screamed again, pounding on the door, begging for it to open. I was out of time. The rats were right there. Just as I was about to give up, the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was the babushka, her eyes hard and determined. Without a word, she grabbed my arm and yanked me through the doorway. She slammed the door shut behind us, locking it with a swift turn of the key. The rats crashed into the door a second later, their squeals muffled by the thick wood. "Run and never look back," she said, her voice cold but steady. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran. My legs moved on instinct, fueled by a raw, primal need to survive. I tore through the hallway, my breath ragged, the cold air burning my lungs. But as I ran, a sinking realization clawed at the back of my mind. I was leaving everything behind. Everything I owned, everything that had ever mattered to me, was still in that apartment. My whole life, the pieces of who I was, now trapped within those cursed walls. My childhood photos, the ones I had kept in a box under my bed, the ones of my parents when they were still alive, the framed picture of my graduation that had always sat on the shelf, memories of moments that shaped me, all left behind. Each object was a piece of me. Together, they were my past, my history, the things that tied me to the life I had lived before, a life I would never get back. The weight of it hit me like a punch to the chest, but I couldn't stop. The building seemed to pulse behind me, angry, alive, as though it could reach out and pull me back in if I slowed down, if I hesitated for even a second. The thought twisted inside me, making my heart ache, but survival came first. The need to live, to breathe, to escape swallowed every other emotion, leaving no room for regret. I had to leave it all behind. All those pieces of my life, all those memories, they couldn't save me now. I knew if I went back, if I tried to save even one thing, I wouldn't make it out again. I kept running, tears blurring my vision, knowing I would never return. I'm still trying to figure out how to start this off. I've never done this before, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form some kind of great storyteller. What I am is a woman with a fairly boring job, with the occasional burst of fucking weirdness. I work for a company that does transcriptions. Work is in quotations because technically we're just freelancers. Honestly, I doubt any of you give a single solitary fuck about the ins and outs of my job, so yeah, I'm just going to jump to the chase here. So most days the audio we get is fairly mundane. Interviews, surveys, Just random marketing or legal things people want to have transcribed for whatever reason. Sometimes, though, we get surprisingly interesting things, like maybe a police interrogation. I've gotten one of those twice so far, or once, an interview between a lawyer and a potential client. Nothing too strange, just part of the job. I've heard from other transcribers in our unofficial Discord, since the company doesn't really want us talking to each other unless it's strictly work-related, that they've had weirder, spookier files, like seriously creepy ones. One guy said he got a series of recordings of some cult meetings. A few others got audio logs from haunted houses, like the ones that are supposedly used for investigations. But until recently, I'd been lucky. None of that spooky shit had crossed my desk. That all changed a few days ago. Honestly, when I first started hearing about those weird transcriptions, I was curious. In that morbid way we all get when we see something on a news headline that we know we shouldn't click on, but we do anyway. I figured, yeah, hearing about creepy stuff is one thing, but I didn't really want to get stuck listening to it, right? But after one of our regulars completely dropped off the radar after doing a particularly disturbing audio file, that morbid curiosity of mine died a quick death. This person, let's call them Jenna, was usually the one who'd shrug off creepy stuff. She used to laugh in the Discord saying, "Hey, if the job doesn't give me nightmares, it's not paying me enough." But after this one particular file, she wasn't laughing. She posted a cryptic message, something about how she was sparing us from having nightmares infecting us too. Then, nothing. Total silence. A few of us had her socials, and she ghosted us on everything. It's been a year, and not a single word. So yeah, by the time I got the file I'm about to talk about, any curiosity I had about this kind of stuff was already on its deathbed. Now, on to the reason I'm typing this out in the first place. A few days ago, I received a transcription file like usual. I opened it up. The file was marked as a police interview, so I thought, hey, that's interesting. And for the first minute or two, it seemed pretty standard. An interviewer asking questions, the person being interviewed answering nervously. But then, things started getting strange. At first, I didn't think much of it. Mrs. Smith, the woman being interviewed, sounded jittery, stressed, which wasn't that unusual in these kinds of files. I've transcribed a few police interrogations before, and the interviewees are almost always nervous. That's just how people are in these situations, right? But as the interview progressed, something about it made me feel uneasy. There was something off about the tone. The way the interviewers were speaking, especially the second guy, seemed so detached, like they weren't really asking questions, but leading her into something. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel it in their voices. It wasn't just police formality. It was colder than that, more clinical. And Mrs. Smith, well, her story was nothing short of bizarre. The interview started innocently enough. Mrs. Smith was explaining a camping trip she had gone on with her cousin. She mentioned how her sister had cancelled last minute, leaving just her and her cousin alone at the campsite. The way she talked about it, it sounded like a normal trip at first, setting up tents, grabbing dinner at a diner nearby. Then she said they started a campfire when they got back to the site. Okay, sure, nothing weird yet, but I had this creeping feeling in my stomach, like I knew something bad was coming. I remember pausing the audio, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, like I was bracing myself for what came next. And then she said it. The moment when she woke up early in the morning before dawn to the sound of her cousin talking. She thought her cousin was just mumbling in her sleep at first, but then she realized the voice was coming from outside her tent. That was when Mrs. Smith said she peeked out and saw her cousin crouched in front of something that looked like a deer, but it was wrong. When I say wrong, I mean Mrs. Smith struggled to describe it, even in the interview. She said the deer was twisted, like parts of it were falling off, like its jaw was hanging by skin, and its ribs were exposed, but it was still standing. That's when my stomach lurched. It wasn't just what Mrs. Smith was saying, but how she said it. There was this fear in her voice, this raw, shaking fear that I swear made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She started sobbing right in the middle of the interview, talking about how her cousin was crouched in front of this thing, trying to help it like it was an injured animal. She said her cousin didn't even seem to see what she was seeing. She thought it was a normal deer. I paused the recording again. I didn't want to hear more, but something made me keep going. Maybe it was that morbid curiosity creeping back, or maybe it was because part of me wanted to know how bad things were about to get. Mrs. Smith kept saying how the deer's throat started to bulge like something was moving inside it, and then, out of its mouth, came fingers. Wet, pale fingers, crawling out like they didn't belong there, like they were attached to something else entirely. The jaw of the deer dropped off completely, and the arm she described as segmented with too many elbows, started to reach for her cousin. I could barely type at that point. My fingers were trembling. It didn't feel like I was listening to some campfire horror story. It felt real, too real. And then Mrs. Smith said the arm grabbed her cousin and pulled her towards the deer, bending her back in ways no human body should bend. The sound of bones snapping. Her cousin didn't even scream. Not once. And Mrs. Smith, she said she ran and didn't look back. I had to stop the recording. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the screen. What the fuck was I listening to? Was this some kind of sick joke? But there was no laughter, no reveal of a prank. This was something else. I debated quitting the transcription right then and there, marking it as abandoned. But the thing is, once you accept a file, you've got a certain amount of time to back out before the system penalizes you. I was past that point. If I dropped it now, I'd lose money and get points docked from my account, and at that point I was too deep. So I hit play again. When Mrs. Smith finished her story, the interview shifted. The first interviewer tried to calm her down, but she was hysterical. Sobbing, shaking, you could hear it in her voice. They offered her water, and she accepted, but something about the way they offered it sounded wrong. Too smooth, too rehearsed. A few minutes passed, and then Mrs. Smith started saying she felt dizzy, sick. She asked for help, and the interviewer, oh God, the way he said it, he told her it was perfectly normal, perfectly fucking normal. I didn't know what was happening. What did they give her? Was it something in the water? I kept listening, my heart racing, trying to understand, and then the last thing I heard chilled me to my core. The interviewer said, I gave you my word you'd learn what happened. Your statements have been taken, your cooperation noted, and now it's time you found out. That's when I stopped the transcription. I couldn't finish it. Whatever happened next, I didn't want to know. I sat there staring at the screen, my fingers shaking. I closed the file and didn't even submit it. I marked it as abandoned and logged out. I haven't been back to work since. Look, I know I'm probably breaking all kinds of rules posting this, but I can't stop thinking about what I heard, about Mrs. Smith, about the way the interviewers spoke to her, about how her voice faded out, confused and scared. I have no idea what happened to her after the audio cut off, and maybe I don't want to know. But something isn't right. I can't shake the feeling that whatever I stumbled into is bigger than just some weird audio file. It's not just some story Mrs. Smith made up. There's a realness to it that keeps gnawing at me. Like it wasn't just a deer or some hallucination, but something else, something unnatural. I've had nightmares every night since then. The kind that stick with you, even after you wake up. Even after you tell yourself it was just a dream. The deer, or whatever that thing was, is always there, standing just outside my bedroom window, its mouth hanging open, its body twitching and bending in impossible ways, and always, always that arm reaches out, pale, segmented, dripping. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, sometimes convinced that I can still hear the low, pulsing sound of the interviewer's voice telling Mrs. Smith she'd learn what happened. I don't know what it is, but something in my gut tells me that was more than a simple interview, more than just a weird story. They were doing something to her, something she didn't understand until it was too late. I've tried telling myself that I'm overreacting, that it was just a job, just an audio file, and I need to get a grip. But then I remember Jenna, and I remember the way she vanished after transcribing something just as strange. I didn't want to believe it back then, but now I get it. Maybe she heard something she wasn't supposed to. Maybe she dug too deep, and they found her. That thought keeps me up at night. I've been avoiding the Discord too. The group used to be my escape, where I could talk shit about the latest boring transcription or laugh about weird audio quality. But now, I'm terrified someone's going to ask why I dropped that file. I'm scared someone's going to ask me if I finished it, or worse, pick it up where I left off, because I don't think anyone should. I don't think anyone else should hear what I heard. I've also noticed something strange. Maybe it's paranoia, or maybe I'm just letting my imagination run wild, but ever since that day, I felt like I'm being watched. I'm not sure if it's all in my head or if something's really going on, But sometimes when I leave my apartment, I get this feeling that there's someone or something just out of sight, watching, waiting. Once I could have sworn I saw a man standing across the street from my building, staring up at my window. He didn't move, didn't do anything, just stood there in the shadows, perfectly still. By the time I worked up the nerve to look again, he was gone. I haven't told anyone about this. How could I? Who's going to believe that I'm being haunted by an audio file? Even I feel ridiculous just thinking about it. But the fear is real, that creeping, unshakable fear that something is coming, and it's only a matter of time before I'm the next one to disappear like Jenna. I've already made peace with the idea that I'm not going back to work. There's no way I can face another transcription after that, and there's definitely no way I'm going to risk coming across something worse. And yet, despite all of this, there's a tiny part of me, deep down, buried under the fear, that still wants to know. A part of me that needs answers. What happened to Mrs. Smith after the recording ended? Who were those interviewers, and why did they seem so unbothered by everything? What was that thing in the woods? And why did it sound like this wasn't the first time they'd encountered something like it? But I can't bring myself to do it. I can't pick up the file again, can't go back to the Discord, and can't risk whatever might happen if I dig any deeper, because something tells me that once you start asking questions, there's no turning back, and I'm not ready for that. Not yet, anyway. I've considered reaching out to someone, an old friend maybe, or even the police, but what would I even say? Hi, I transcribed a creepy audio file and now I think I'm being stalked by some kind of supernatural entity. Yeah, that'd go over real well. They'd probably think I'm losing my mind, and maybe I am. But I can't shake the feeling that something is coming for me, that it's just waiting for the right moment. The other night, I was lying in bed when I heard something outside my window, a soft rustling, like leaves brushing against the glass. My heart practically stopped in my chest. I told myself it was just the wind, just some branches swaying in the breeze, but then I heard it again, closer this time, like something was right outside. I didn't have the guts to look. I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst. The sound came again and then silence. I don't know what it was. Maybe I'm losing it. Maybe the fear has just gotten to me. But ever since that night, I've started double-checking my locks, making sure all the windows are shut tight before I go to bed. I can't help but feel like something is waiting for me to slip up, to leave an opening. I've thought about leaving town, getting as far away from this place as I can, but where would I go? The thought of running only makes me feel like I'm delaying the inevitable, like no matter where I go, it'll find me. That's why I'm writing this. I don't know what else to do. Maybe this is my way of getting it off my chest, or maybe it's just me trying to make sense of everything. But if something happens to me, if I disappear, like Jenna did, then at least someone will know. At least someone will understand that it wasn't just in my head. So if you're reading this, take my advice. Don't pick up the files, don't listen to the recordings, and for the love of God, if you ever come across something that feels off, stop, walk away. Don't let curiosity get the best of you, because once you start down this path, there's no going back. And trust me, you don't want to know what's waiting at the end. I've done some bad things in my life, things I was never proud of, but they always felt necessary in the moment. Theft, counterfeiting, that was the bulk of it. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I'd had a couple heavier gigs when I was younger, real ugly stuff. Still, I'd never thought of myself as evil. I was just a guy trying to survive, always one step ahead of the law. Or so I thought. Now I'm not so sure. A lot of innocent people are dead because of me, people who never even knew my name, who never did anything wrong except for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I don't know if anyone's going to find out about it unless I say something myself. I've done really, really bad things now, and it's tearing me apart. This all started right near the end of the 90s when I met a guy called Grin. It was during one of those more serious gigs, the kind where you don't ask too many questions. Grin was a bear of a man, must have been at least 6'4", 250 pounds or more, with a wild black beard and eyes that seemed to bore into you. Eastern European, though he didn't talk much about home. Once or twice he mentioned Belarus, but that was it. Always wore the same thing, ratty denim jacket, black toque, and an air that said, "Don't fuck with me." You never really noticed Grin unless you had to. Not because he was invisible, but because people just didn't look at him. He was the kind of guy who radiated danger, and nobody wanted to be the one to catch his attention. I asked once why the crew called him Grin, and he just glared at me. That stare, like a coiled snake ready to strike. Someone else in the crew piped up. The fucker's never grinned, not once, and this is my 4th job with him. Grin was a talent though, I'll give him that. Guy could pick a lock like nobody's business, and he packed a left hook that could drop a guard in one punch. He proved that on this job, laying 2 guards flat, guys we hadn't even anticipated. These weren't your run-of-the-mill rent-a-cops either. They had military tattoos, and I realized we were dealing with more than we'd signed up for. The job? We were stealing engineering blueprints for some kind of medical device. It looked like an oversized insulin pump. I don't normally take gigs that deal with industrial espionage. It's too high risk. But this one came from a trusted source. Emilio, a bookie I'd known for years, vouched for the client, said it'd be easy, said the payout was big, and for a long time, I trusted Emilio. He'd never screwed me over. When it was time to drop off the goods, the others sent Grin with me to meet Emilio and the client. The meet was in a strip mall parking lot. You'd be surprised how many shady deals go down in broad daylight. People are too caught up in their daily lives to notice anything out of the ordinary. Emilio was already there with the client, waiting in an older Buick. The client got out, introduced himself as Grigori. This guy was unsettling. He was old, late 60s at least, with pale skin and sunken eyes. He had this thick Eastern European accent, too, same as Grin's. When Grigori started talking to us, Grin immediately responded in Russian, or at least I think it was Russian. I couldn't tell. I just stood there, feeling like an outsider as they talked back and forth for a couple of minutes. But what caught me off guard, what really threw me, was that Grin was smiling. I had never seen him smile before, not once. After a few more minutes, Grin opened the trunk of my beat-up Volkswagen Rabbit and handed Grigori the medical device we'd stolen. Grigori seemed pleased, more than pleased, grateful. He switched back to English and thanked both of us, handing us each $2,500 in cash on top of the $20,000 we were splitting with the others. Now, you don't ask clients why they want what they're paying you for. That's just how it works. But this whole job felt off, and my curiosity got the better of me, so I asked Grigori what the device was for. Bad move. Grigori's face instantly darkened, the friendly demeanor gone in a flash. His eyes were cold when he answered, "Not good manners in our line of work to ask why someone needs something after they've paid you for it. But I will forgive it this time." I didn't say a word, I just nodded, but he wasn't done. He continued, his voice low and deliberate. "The pump is part of a medical system built by a former business partner. He stole the designs from the original inventor, my eldest brother, Anton. Anton died last month, penniless and ruined by Victor's betrayal. Victor stole the first reliquary prototype from us back in Croatia 3 years ago. I spent everything, trying to get it back for Anton, but I was too late." There was something about the way he said reliquary that made my skin crawl. I knew that word. An old neighbor of mine growing up was Catholic and kept a small reliquary in her home. It was a vessel for holding holy relics. The hell was a medical device doing with a name like that? I didn't ask more questions, not then anyway. That night, lying in bed with some random guy I'd picked up after a night of drinking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The job, the device, Grigori's strange story about betrayal and death, it didn't add up. Grigori had money, plenty of it, so why not go after Victor with lawyers instead of hiring a crew of thieves? And what kind of medical research facility needed ex-military security? Slowly, over time, I let the job slip from my mind. Did a couple more gigs with Grin, made some money, and lost contact with him after 2001. Things went south for me eventually. I ended up serving 4 years for something unrelated. By the time I got out, it was 2007, and I was trying to rebuild my life. 2 weeks after my release, I saw him. Grin, standing at a bus stop across the street from my meeting with my CO, scowling, as always. He hadn't changed much, but something about him seemed off. I ran across the street to catch up with him, hopped on the bus right behind him, and sat in a seat ahead. After a couple stops, I turned around, looked him dead in the eyes, and asked, "Grin, you don't even remember me, do you?" He didn't respond at first, just stared at me like he was trying to bore a hole into my skull. 20 seconds of pure Silent tension passed before he finally spoke. "No," he said, voice raspy. "I just wish I never met you. You made me meet Grigori. We stole for a demon. I have a gift now." His voice cracked, and then he started shaking, trembling like a man trying to hold back tears. But this wasn't crying. It was something else, a sound like air being sucked through a broken windpipe. It was unnatural, and the other passengers were starting to notice too. They stared, confused, uneasy. That's when I got up. Something was wrong. Grin looked sick, like death had been hanging over him for a long time. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched over bones that seemed too thin. His bloodshot eyes were sunken, lifeless, not really focusing on anything. I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed it earlier. Grin didn't look human anymore. I stepped back, my heart racing. His skin, if you could call it that, hung like it was barely attached. He looked like a walking corpse. His jaw suddenly unhinged, opening impossibly wide, rows of jagged teeth gleaming in the dim bus lights. Then he moved. No, he exploded into action. His legs twisted, bones snapping and protruding through the skin as he launched himself across the bus. I stumbled backward, the sheer force of his leap shattering the windows at the rear of the bus. Glass flew everywhere, and the entire back end of the vehicle crumpled, landing on a cyclist behind us. I'll never forget her face. Francesca Paoli, 24, the first to die. The grin suit, that's what I called it in my mind now, because this thing wasn't grin anymore, slashed through the air, bone spikes ripping from its wrists. It tore through the other passengers like they were nothing. Robbie Engleton, Mahmoud Abbas, Tegan Sumner. They never stood a chance. In the chaos, I tried to help Tegan, tried to hold her throat closed, but there was nothing left to save. More died. Jackson Owusu, the driver, was crushed when the thing leaped off his seat, and then it came for me. Its mouth, too large, too grotesque. The grin suit's mouth, too large and too grotesque to be human, came for me. I barely had time to react as its gaping maw, filled with far too many rows of teeth, descended toward me. I stumbled backward, my body in pure survival mode, flailing as I tried to avoid the death coming for me. The bus shook as the grin suit's body contorted, coiling to spring at me like a twisted predator. I scrambled over Tegan's body, my foot slipping in her blood. It was a nightmare. Everywhere I turned, there were bodies, blood, and broken glass. I could hear the thing's jagged breaths, that unnatural sucking noise as it choked out something unintelligible. "We can share the reliquary with you," it hissed. "You can be more." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. The reliquary, that damned device, it wasn't just some medical pump. It was something far worse, something that had turned Grin into this thing, and now it wanted to offer me the same fate. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was running on pure adrenaline and panic. As the grin suit loomed over me, its bone spikes raised. I fumbled in my jacket pocket. My fingers found the cold metal of my lighter, and in the other pocket, my old can of Axe body spray. I was too terrified to even think, but I knew one thing. If I didn't act now, I was dead. With a scream, I flicked the Zippo open and sprayed the Axe can, sending a jet of fire directly into the grin suit's face. The thing recoiled, shrieking in agony as the flames licked at its pale, decayed skin. Its mouth snapped shut, and for a moment, the bus was filled with a terrible hissing noise as its skin crackled and bubbled. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. With the fire still spraying in the thing's direction, I yanked my foot free of the bone spike that had pinned me to the floor, screaming in pain as I did. The grin suit flailed, the fire consuming it. I didn't have time to be relieved. I threw myself out of a shattered window, slicing my arms and legs as I tumbled onto the street below. My head spun from the pain, but I forced myself to stand. I could hear the thing thrashing inside the bus, the shrieks growing louder, more desperate. People on the street were running, screaming, trying to make sense of the chaos, but I couldn't stop. I knew that if I didn't keep moving, that thing would recover. It wasn't human anymore. Fire alone wouldn't be enough to stop it. I limped down the street, trying to put as much distance between myself and the burning bus as possible. Every step sent a jolt of pain through my body, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let the grin suit catch me. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually the adrenaline wore off, and I collapsed in an alleyway, clutching my bleeding foot. My mind raced, replaying everything I'd just seen, the faces of the people on the bus, The way they'd been torn apart in seconds. The way Grin had turned into something unnatural, something that shouldn't exist. But the worst part, the part that kept haunting me, was what it said. "We can share the reliquary with you." I'd been right all those years ago. The reliquary wasn't just a medical device, it was something more sinister, something that could turn a person into a monster, and I had helped steal it. I had delivered it into the hands of people like Grigori. God knows how many more of these things are out there now, walking among us, waiting to strike. I blacked out at some point, lost to the pain and exhaustion. When I woke up, I was in a hospital, cuffed to the bed. 2 men in suits stood at the door, watching me with cold, calculating eyes. They didn't introduce themselves, but I didn't need them to. I knew what they were. They started talking to me, laying out the story. I was being held as the sole suspect in a transit bombing. 7 people had died in the explosion. They told me I was responsible, and that the media was already reporting it as a terrorist attack. They didn't care about the truth. I was just a convenient scapegoat. I didn't argue. I didn't beg or plead. I knew they weren't interested in what really happened. They weren't going to let me go. Whatever had really gone down on that bus, they weren't going to acknowledge it. Hell, they probably knew what had happened. But here's the thing, they underestimated me. Later that night, when one of them left for coffee and the other went to the bathroom, I made my move. I slipped out of the bed, cuff and all, and cracked the guy in the head with the nearest object, a metal walker, knocked him cold, switched into his clothes, disconnected myself from the heart monitor, and walked right out of the hospital without anyone batting an eye. A couple cops passed me in the lobby, but no one stopped me. By the time they realized I was gone, I was halfway out of the city, hitchhiking with some farm workers who didn't ask too many questions. I spent the next few days hiding out, trying to figure out my next move. I knew I couldn't go back to my old life. I couldn't trust anyone. The cops thought I was a terrorist, and Grigori's people, whoever they were still out there. If they found me, I had no doubt I'd end up like Grin. But I couldn't let it go. The guilt, the horror, it gnawed at me. 6 innocent people were dead because of me. Because I had taken that job, because I had handed that damn device to Grigori. I couldn't just run. I couldn't hide forever. So I started looking for answers. It took years, 4 years of running, hiding and investigating on my own. But eventually, I found Grigori again. I wish I hadn't. I tracked him down to a crumbling estate outside of some godforsaken Eastern European village. I don't know how I made it there without being killed, but I did. Grigori looked different now, older, weaker, but still with that same calculating glint in his eye. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "I knew you'd come," he said in that same thick accent, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You want to know what you helped me do, what the reliquary truly is?" I nodded, too exhausted to speak. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened to Grin, what had happened to all those people. Grigori smiled, a thin, almost serpentine smile. "The reliquary," he said, "is not a device. It is a doorway, a gateway to something greater, something that can make a man more than human. But there is a price. There is always a price." I didn't say anything. I just listened, the horror settling into my bones. "Your friend Grin," he continued, "was the first, but there have been others since, many others. We are building an army, you see, an army of those who are more than men. And soon the world will know what we have created." I don't remember what happened next. My memory goes blank after that. Maybe I blacked out again, or maybe I just don't want to remember. But when I came to, the estate was in flames and Grigori was dead. I'm on the run again now, hiding, always looking over my shoulder. I don't know how long I have before they find me, but I had to write this down. I had to let someone know. If you're reading this, if you ever come across the name Reliquary, stay the hell away. Don't ask questions, don't get involved, because once you open that door, there's no closing it. And trust me, you don't want to know what's on the other side. I was 11 when doorways broke. I mean broke in the sense that they no longer consistently worked the way doorways are supposed to. It's hard to explain. It started with little things. The first time I remember something strange happening, I had walked from the kitchen into the living room, and as I passed the threshold, suddenly there was this vase of flowers on the table that I was sure hadn't been there the moment before. They were large, bright sunflowers, and I had no idea how I could have missed them. but they were clearly there, and so I figured I just hadn't been paying attention. I was only 11 after all. Everything else seemed fine. I put it out of my head. After that day, however, similar things started to happen more frequently. Or maybe I just noticed them more. Mostly it was little things. I would follow my mum through a door and suddenly she was wearing a different shirt than she had been a moment ago. Or her hairstyle had changed. One notable time it was suddenly dyed fiery red when it had been its usual brown before we left the house. I would search everywhere for my favorite stuffed animal, only to find it sitting in its normal place on my bed when I gave up and went back to my room. I would go downstairs to watch my favorite show, only to be told that it always aired on Thursdays, not Fridays, even though I was certain of the timing. That sort of thing happened so often that my parents began to worry that something was wrong with my memory. They took me to a series of specialists and had a bunch of tests done, but if anything, they found that my memory was better than average. The conversation then shifted to discussions about hallucinations and a possible psychiatric diagnosis. At that point, I pretty much stopped mentioning when something unusual happened, but that didn't mean the incident stopped. For a long time, I just tried to pretend nothing was wrong. It was easy, as long as the changes were small, but occasionally, something shifted that was difficult to ignore. Not just a missing item, or a different colored shirt, but a change that mattered to me, one that hurt. The first time that happened, I was 16. I had just started dating my first real boyfriend. He was a sweet guy named Sean from my homeroom class, and we had gone on several dates. The morning it happened, I woke up to get ready for school and noticed that the bracelet he gave me the week before was missing. I was sure I had left it on my desk yesterday, but I realized I hadn't checked for it after I entered my room to get ready for bed. I cursed, knowing something must have shifted the last time I entered the room. I wasn't sure how I was going to explain that to Sean, but I hoped he would understand. I had a reputation for misplacing things and being absent-minded, so it wouldn't really be a surprise. I showed up a bit early to school, hoping to talk to him alone, but when I got to his locker, he was there with Shannon Maguire. I remember the way he smiled, then leaned in and kissed her. Bracelet forgotten. I stormed over and demanded to know how long he had been cheating on me. The fact that we had only been dating for about a month really limited the possibilities, but I wasn't thinking about that at the time. Sean just looked at me with genuine confusion and asked what I was talking about. He and Shannon had been exclusive for a full year. In fact, today was their anniversary. Shannon showed off her bracelet with a sneer, apparently concluding that I was simply delusional and pathetic, having some imaginary relationship with her boyfriend. At least I knew why the bracelet wasn't on my desk. I went home sick from school that day. I cried all afternoon but wouldn't tell my parents what was wrong. They wouldn't have understood anyway. How could they? How could I ever explain that for me, every doorway had at least a small chance of depositing me in the room I was aiming for? But in an alternate reality, where things were somewhat different from the one I had been in only moments before. Mostly, these alternate realities were close enough that it was hard to even notice the differences, but not always. Most concerningly, I had no control over when this happened or what changed, and no way to tell how many times I had accidentally slipped between realities since all this started. I often wonder what my life is like in the reality I came from originally, but I don't even know where that place is. The only things I can be sure won't change or disappear whenever I cross a threshold are the things I have on my person. Those travel with me, but for everything else all bets are off. Unfortunately, that is also true for people. The weekend of my 21st birthday, I traveled home from university to visit my parents. That was a tough time in my life, honestly. I was still coming to terms with how my condition was going to affect the rest of my life. I had already started calculating the most efficient path of travel in every situation to minimize door crossings in my day-to-day life. I was careful to never double back, and if I forgot something in my room, well, I would just have to do without it for the day. It helped, but in modern society, you can't really avoid all doorways. This meant that, despite my efforts, there was a decent chance that any assignment I turned in was at least partially incorrect, because the questions had changed subtly between when I received it and when I handed it in. I also missed a lot of tests when scheduling changes occurred and flaked on a lot of plans I had made with people. As a result, I hadn't made many friends at school, and those I did manage to make had a nasty tendency to forget that I even existed at random intervals. So, I was very glad to be home with people who loved me and were mostly used to my odd behavior. I slept in late on Saturday morning, and when I came down for breakfast, something was wrong. My mum had made banana pancakes for my birthday every year for as long as I could remember, but this year there was nothing cooking when I came down. I will admit I was disappointed, but these types of changes happened to me so often that I was also kind of used to it. So, I simply headed to the pantry to make some myself and found a strange woman emerging with a can of beets. I said hello cautiously, and she smiled, wished me a happy birthday and slipped past me into the kitchen. She seemed to know me, so I figured my parents must have a new friend. It wasn't the first time that had happened, so I didn't think much of it, until I returned to the kitchen with my pancake ingredients to find her sitting with my dad, her hand touching his cheek in a way that was clearly intimate. My dad smiled and wished me a happy birthday, but I barely heard him. Part of me already knew what had happened, and I knew I shouldn't say anything about it. It wouldn't end well, but I just couldn't stop myself from asking where Mum was. I watched my father's face fall. I heard him remind me with pity in his voice that she had died 5 years ago. That surely I remembered my stepmother, Veronica. I didn't stay to hear any more. No one understood why I was suddenly grieving for my mother, as if her death had only just occurred. Certainly no one understood why I spent 2 days continually walking in and out of rooms, back and forth across the threshold until I collapsed. It didn't work. Maybe there was no way to go back. Maybe the odds were just so low that it would never practically happen. Either way, it took me a long time, but I came to accept that my mum was truly gone. It helped to know that somewhere out there, she was still alive, living her life, even if I can't be there with her. It also helped to think that there is a version of me that woke up that day to find that their mother was suddenly alive again. I just hope it isn't the me I'm worried it is. You know how people say you are often your own worst enemy? I think that may be more literal for me than for some people. More than once, after a shift, I have found signs that something unsettling has happened before I arrived. I don't know if that is because I am always following behind the same person, or if many versions of myself have broken, like the doorways, under the strain of our shared situation. All I know is that sometimes I think I've done terrible things. It's frustrating, because there isn't really anything I can do to stop it. I just have to follow in behind and clean up the mess. Deal with the angry spouses, or the vandalism charges, or the lawsuits, which means I don't just have to worry about the universe screwing me over, but another version of myself, too. There wasn't much I could do, though, so I just tried to manage my condition as best as I could. I avoided getting too close to anyone, because there is no way to tell if they will even know me tomorrow, or if I will do something to hurt them. I even pulled away from my family. My dad thinks I developed a sudden dislike of my stepmother, Monica, and it isn't like I could explain that that isn't the problem, or that I liked Veronica better. He doesn't even remember who Veronica was. I also started carrying everything most precious to me in a small backpack everywhere I go. Anything I don't have on me could disappear at any time. So I guess you can probably imagine that I have a pretty minimalist lifestyle. I live in a studio apartment, I work from home, order most of my groceries delivered, and don't go out much. The more I can minimize doorways, the less chaos gets injected into my life. The only separate room is the bathroom. I tried taking the door off the hinges, but I have found that as long as the doorway is still there, it doesn't really make a difference. I doubted my landlord would let me demolish a wall, so I just put the door back on. At least I had minimized my problems, but minimized and eliminated aren't the same thing. Which is how I ended up in my current situation. I woke up today and everything was fine. My apartment was a bit messy, of course. It usually isn't worth it to spend too much time cleaning when it can so easily be undone, but nothing was out of place. I took a quick shower and emerged to find myself in a scene from a horror movie. My main room was spattered in blood, and there was a dead body lying on my kitchen floor in a rapidly spreading pool of red. I was certain that hadn't been there when I went into the bathroom. I didn't even know who the guy was. But it didn't matter, did it? It was my problem now, and I apparently wasn't the only one who knew that, because on the wall above my bed, scrawled in what I can only assume was blood, was the message, "Good luck." Well, at least now I know it is intentional. The me that goes before knows that they can do whatever they want and then leave the fallout for someone else to deal with. Have they figured out a way to control it somehow? They must have. Otherwise, how could they be sure they could escape? I have entered and exited the bathroom 100 times since I found the body and haven't been able to shift it away. If there is a way to control this, maybe I can turn the tables. Maybe I can reverse directions and find her, the one who did this, and stop her before she kills again. Maybe I can even find my way back to the people I have lost along the way. But I suspect that is going to have to wait. I can hear the sirens outside. The police will be here any minute. How can I possibly explain that I didn't do this? Actually, did I technically do this? If the killer was me, but a different me who is now gone, I suppose in some ways I am the only one left to be held responsible, but I need to find a way out of this if I want to stop it from happening again. I've heard that Reddit is a good place for legal advice, so if anyone knows a good defense attorney with a very open mind, hit me up. If they let me keep my phone, I'll try to check in.